Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Conglomerati Conference. I'm Marta Arnaldi, and I'm very, very delighted to be presenting the first panel. Before introducing the speakers, I would like to thank Adele, Roberto, and Nicola for the organization of this important event and for their kind invitation. The first panel, Conglomerates 1, will be dealing with topics of poetry, theory of the lyric, and reception. And I have the pleasure to introduce three speakers, Diego Terzano, Francesco Venturi, and Andele Bardazzi. I will be giving a few biographical notes before each contribution. I will start with Diego Terzano, who will be delivering a paper entitled Os Inferum Superum on Sublime, Style and Body in Gli Sguardi, Fatti e Senhal. Diego is a PhD student in Studi Italianistici at the University of Pisa and in Langue, Littérature and Civilisation Italienne at the Université Côte d'Azur. And he holds a degree from the University of Genoa. At the moment, he's researching the influence of Carlo Michelstötter's work in the 20th century. And he's also editorial assistant for the academic journal Lumina, rivista di linguistica storica e di letteratura comparata. A few years ago, he sat on the organizing committee of the International Graduate Conference Interruzioni and Cesure. So I'm very delighted to leave the floor to Diego.
Thank you so much, Marta. Good morning, everybody. Buongiorno a tutti e a tutte. I'm delighted to be here, albeit virtually. I would like to thank the organizing committee for making this all possible, as well as the scientific committee for selecting my paper. I am very honored to give this speech at the conference. So I'm going to share my presentation. Here I am. All right. Perfect. Do you see that? Okay, thank you. So to start off, I would like to set the goal of my paper around three main points. Firstly, I will highlight the critical role of the classic Sublime in Zanzotto's Gli Sguardi, Fatti e Senhal. To do so, I will consider what the so-called Pseudo-Longinus theorized in the Perî ὕψους, that is, on the Sublime, written in the 1st century AD. Secondly, I will be outlining the function of sublimity in the poem, for its inner syntax appears to enclose a dynamic duality if considered from a general and minimal point of view. Such duality can be ascribed to the concept of the Sublime itself. Finally, I will connect these two problems to a discussion of Zanzotto's interpretation of Longinus, for the way he read the ancient theory of the Sublime has to do with the poem itself. On the one hand, the Sublime was a structural theme of the poem. On the other hand, Zanzotto's hermeneutics of the Sublime can be intended as a structural misreading that relates to a body-stylistic dichotomy. This leads to many consequences on a hermeneutic level and connects to the very framework of my paper at any rate. I do think that Zanzotto oriented Gli Sguardi Fatti e Senhal in a polar fashion, thinking of the Sublime as a matter of style and body, or body-psyche. More exactly, the Sublime reversibly links what Zanzotto would call os inferum to what he would call os superum. Here I refer to a theoretical clash Zanzotto sketched out in 1990. In the very same year, Gli Sguardi Fatti e Senhal got a major new edition in Milan. I will return on all these topics and try to demonstrate that. Now, speaking of the poem's publication, Gli Sguardi Fatti e Senhal was first published privately in Pieve di Soligo right after the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. Here, Zanzotto provided a profound and chaotic conceptualization of the event subspecie subliminis, for he needed to point out the anthropological shift it implied on a psychic, symbolic, and philosophical level. The poet was able to work out a massive network of voices that in turn ask for the voice of the moon itself. In 79 stanzas, 60 characters appear, the moon and 59 others. Since each one of them speaks exactly throughout one stanza, the poem can be formally identified as a dialogue, that is to say, something deeply rooted in language, physically in the mouth, what in Latin is the os. I here refer to the os inferum-os superum dichotomy again. I will return on that. So within Zanzotto's rich scholarship, some studies exist that explore the role of the sublime in Zanzotto's work, the poem itself, and its inner duality. You can find them here on screen. Within these works, Andrea Cortellessa and Chiara Portesine pointing out the influence of the neo-avanguardia on Gli Sguardi, Fatti, Senhal. At any case, Gli Sguardi, Fatti, Senhal wasn't considered as an applicative plan of the polar reversibility theorized by Zanzotto himself in 1990. Now, having established such a theoretical ground, let me review and discuss the quotations from Longinus' inquiry in the poem. The analysis I'm going to carry out, in fact, requires such a preventive discussion. So here's the stanza 56, which contains the 16th speech of the moon. Per tivucinema l'animo nostro si innalza, come se da lui stesso fosse generato ciò che egli ha udito e visto. In his explanatory notes, Zanzotto refers to the so-called tivucinema, TV cinema, and clarifies the influence of Longinus on the Sublime. He also provides a translation from the second section of the 7th chapter of the essay, where Longinus talks about the action of the true Sublime, tales ὕψους. Here it is, you can find this on the right of the screen. Per sua natura l'animo nostro si innalza come se da lui stesso fosse generato ciò che ha udito. As we can see by looking at the stanza, Zanzotto replaces nature, physis, with tivucinema, that is a symbolic concretion of mass mediatic fetishism. This implies that the media could transform the symbolic diminution of the moon into something natural to some extent, since they broadcast the moon landing and talked a lot about it, making it something like a consumer product that can be seen, visto. Not only does Zanzotto deal with the way our soul is modified by the tivucinema, he also stretches the implications of the sublime on a body-psyche level. Therefore, such a psychic amplification comes to concern not only our hearing faculty, but also our sight. This opinion clearly refers to a visual supremacy, since tivucinema was the dominant medium at the time, and no one could escape such an amplification. I am now going to quote from stanza 68. Again, the moon is speaking. Non liquideremo per sempre l'entusiasmo, e quello che non sarò mai e non voglio essere stata, aboliremo, devieremo, non leggeremo più per ὕψους. This was the 17th speech of the moon. 2 explanatory notes refer to this stanza. In the first one, Zanzotto explains the meaning of enthusiasm by etymological means, that is, something connected to the invasione, ispirazione, sopraffazione divina. In the second note, it simply clarifies its reference to Longinus, so I didn't quote that. Now, a strong liaison can be easily detected here between the idea of the sublime and that of enthusiasm. They both appear to be lost, since such ancient sublimity got to be somehow annihilated or decreased. What we need to point out here is that already Longinus links the very idea of the sublime to that of enthusiasm. Specifically, he affirmed the importance of fantasy, that is a creative imagination. Such a fantasy was seen as a means to achieve the sublime if conceived as a synthesis of passion, pathos, and enthusiasm itself, enthusiasmos. I refer here to chapter 15 of the essay, and Zanzotto does it too, I think. So here are 2 critical points. First, enthusiasm has to do with a divine symbology. Etymologically, it is conceived as a mean to approach a sky-high divinity or sublimity. Second, the strong bond between enthusiasm and sublime is confirmed by the manuscript of the poem. As Mattia Carbone states in his comment on the poem, Zanzotto often replaces sublime with enthusiasm there and vice versa. Therefore, we are dealing with the killing of the god ship of the moon, that is to say, landing on the moon equals liquidating enthusiasm forever. As a consequence, I would argue, Zanzotto explanatory notes point to divinity as a lost feature of the outraged moon, since it describes the poem not only as related to the central detail of the first card of the Rorschach test, not only as a poetic contrasto between 59 characters and the moon, not only as a parody of entertainment media and the current literary debate, but also as a fragmented and inaccurate narration of, quote, the human approach to the moon goddess until contact. Now, enough with enthusiasm. Let's now briefly examine the reversible duality of the poem so as to understand how the Sublime could elicit an os superum, os inferum dichotomy. As I mentioned, Gli Sguardi, Fatti, Senhal got a new edition in Milan in 1919, the so-called Collana dei Poeti dello Specchio. The central detail of the first Rorschach card can be found in the very first page of the book. Looking at it, both a D and a uterus can be seen so that we can recall Diana, that is, the ancient moon goddess and an archetypal feminine. Such a detail represents the Senhal, the sign underlying the center of the poem. This leads to the next point of my analysis. An overall interpretation of this was carried out in the so-called Intervento di Ivrea, that is a conversation between Stefano Agosti and Andrea Zanzotto, which was held in 1973, and that now closes the 1990 edition. It consists of two essays, both dealing with the moon Diana as a feminine deity and the Sublime itself. Zanzotto states that, quote, the wounding of the primitive myth of the moon relating to that of Diana has to do with something, quote, deeply rooted in humankind and to, quote, a capillary disruption of the human psychic tissues. Well, such a self-reading implies a synthesis between a lower and a higher speculative pole. Thereafter, Zanzotto adds that Longinus on the Sublime is still very important for us since it implies an analogy with our senses. Moreover, that's a crucial point, he states that a negative Sublime can be conceived in the contemporary era, that is, that of tivucinema. It thus clarifies how he was able to polarize his thought while dealing with sublimity, I think. Now, as I mentioned, the fact that Zanzotto devised the os superum, os inferum dichotomy right in 1990 is significant. We can find such a theory in some notes collected in Prospezioni Consultivi under the title Tra ombre di percezioni fondanti. Such notes were first published in Perî in 1990. What is at stake here is a dialectical relationship between two, quote, founding perception. These are the very words of Zanzotto. Now, although perceptions do come from our body and senses, the poet is talking about style here, that is, two expressive choices or needs that appear to be connected to the body. On the one hand, Zanzotto theorizes una poesia sommamente impura, quasi gorgogliata, ricadente in sé, that is, os inferum. On the other hand, una poesia che è sempre più autonoma nel dare una spinta al sistema stilistico da essa elaborato. Here, Zanzotto states, the words recall each other, so creating a way greater separation, that is, an opposition between some kind of a superum and an inferum condition of language. Now, what is clear to Zanzotto is that these two poles are ideal. Actually, he states they always get to be intersected, and there is no possibility to write without reversing the inferum pole into the superum one, and vice versa. To explain this, he readapts the Virgilian quotation from the beginning of Freud's interpretation of dreams. Flectere sine quo superos, acheronta movebo. Since I cannot regard the celestial gods to truly understand humanity, states, I will move the acheron, that is the darkest ground of the psyche, of the body psyche. Doing so, Zanzotto ships a strong analogy between style and psychoanalysis. In fact, he adds that psychoanalysis is a back and forth movement between the unconscious, the unspoken, and what is not entirely utterable, and it's becoming itself a word. As we will see, this directly relates to the first Rorschach card. Now, here we are. In the os inferum superum paradigm, an ideal vertical orientation can be noticed between the two poles. The founding stylistic perception comes from the deeper body psyche, which can be transcended in a high absolute stylistic dominance or in a chaotic body style, so to say. The latter, however, is still a matter of style, shaping something like an absolute system. Here, a divine stylistic enthusiasm relates to the fantasy of the Acheron. Now, a very similar pattern describes Gli Sguardi, Fatti, Senhal, so that a liaison can be imagined between the poem and these notes from 1990 with regard to the two founding perception. In the poem, the Mundayana represents a superum high pole, which comes to be reversibly depressed because of her wounding, so that her snowy whiteness is outraged and she appears as a stabbed body. In the 14th stanza, in fact, someone says that he knew about the fact, while putting in sublimity the laborious snow. In the 17th stanza, someone else says, I knew about your wounding, ho saputo del tuo ferimento. In the 18th one, the mooner sad declares, I was the trauma in this immense body of beauty. Ero il trauma in questo immenso corpo di bellezza. This is the pathos, the passion of the body of the moon. The same first card of the Rorschach test is the lower pole, since it directly relates to the abyss of the psyche and body psyche, namely the Acheron, which Zanzotto tries to move in order to elaborate on what's rooted in the psychic tissues not disrooted. Nevertheless, it is a graphic production which verbalizes the aforementioned somatic abyss lying in our psyche. It brings it to the surface and reaches divinity if seen as a reference to Diana. The D centrale, the central D, appears in the 12th and in the 62nd stanza within two far different linguistic registers, a lower and a higher one. In any case, such a dynamic was described in the Intervento di Ivrea. Naturalmente, oltre all'evento lunare, Zanzotto states, si tentava di proiettare tutto l'insieme delle situazioni a livello più basso possibile. Quale? Quello di un test psicologico proiettivo, appunto. Danny adds, il test proiettivo è dunque, di per sé, un non senso che è destinato a divenire un senso, a nonsense per se, which is fated to become a sense. This relates to his interpretation of psychoanalysis, as you can see. To move on towards the final section of my paper, I have no time for an in-depth discussion of the etymology of sublime, which at any rate is pretty uncertain. Still, the word may somehow be referred to the idea of limen. And that's why Zanzotto could have thought of an inferum and a superum limen. Such an understanding could explain the structural inner sublimity of the poem, which is vertically polarized along an inferum and a superum end, reversibly linked to each given opposite. Zanzotto, for this reason, could have thought of a contemporary negative sublimity. In any case, such a structural twofold sublimity does exist within the poem, coming from an inventive misreading of Longinus' essay. I am thinking of the Bloomian excited influence, of course. While he speaks of a negative sublimity in the Ivrea Intervento, Zanzotto indeed betrays the very word of Longinus, since there's nothing like a negative sublimity in the Perį. The Longinian sublime is a matter of style, that is to say, the highest linguistic register. Nevertheless, there's something different to consider in order to pinpoint a debt toward Longinus on a fundamental level. That is the same reference to pathos and enthusiasm within the poem. According to Longinus, as I mentioned, a sublime linguistic style comes with a relation to the natural pathos and irrational enthusiasm. That is to say, it comes with a perception as long as it is rooted in our body. Such a stylistic perception embraces something like a divine Platonic mania, which Zanzotto connects to the absolute divinity of the Mundayana. While the 1990 notes from Prospezioni Consuntivi reflect this, Zanzotto managed to organize the symbolic tumult following the moon landing in Gli Sguardi, Fatti, Senhal, as he reread such Longinian topics and moved about between styles and themes. Since he inherently looked to a dynamic sublimity that reverses the thematic centers of Gli Sguardi, Fatti, Senhal body style-wise, the chaos only lies on the poem's surface. In conclusion, such an idea of dynamicity happens to replicate the inner meaning of the second proper etymology of sublime, an oblique motion from below, that is to say, something that connects a lower and a higher pole rather than separating the one from the other. Thinking of such an etymology, Zanzotto might have organized the Gli Sguardi Fatti Senhal by employing the sublime on a structural level, that is to say, as a formal notion which dynamically, continuously reunites what was divided by a necessary polarization. Thank you.